well, Manchester, really. You have to excuse my somewhat English definition of latitude. So people lived closer to the equator than Manchester, right? People move on a massive scale with those kinds of changes, and we have to recognize that. It's not a matter of maybe losing 25% of agricultural output. I mean, it's a shame, but that's not the big part of it. The big part of it is a radical change in where people can live. We don't know what would happen to the North Indian monsoon, but probably it would have changed way before that. The snows, ice off the Himalayas would mostly be gone. Not all of it, but mostly be gone. I mean, imagine that kind of radical change to how and where you could live. Much of Bangladesh would be submerged. Well, where are they going to go? You know, these are huge issues. As I say, and I sometimes react against framing them as a 25% loss in... it doesn't begin to tell the story. So we ought to recognize not only the stakes that we're playing for, which are immense, because that's where we're going at the moment, and the magnitude of the change. Unless we do, we're not seriously engaging with this issue. So that was the major part of what I wanted to say, and it's the motivation of the new climate economy story. Now let me just say something about equity, because it matters enormously. Up to now I gave the arithmetic, and then I started to get into the economics of policies and co-benefits and so on. But this is a deeply inequitable story, because it's quite obvious that all countries have to get down to something like 2 tons per capita. And that it's very different from the path they're headed on now. So we all have to participate in a problem that is many ways looking backwards, largely of the rich countries making, but looking forwards, because everybody is emitting looking forwards, and developing world is already the majority of emissions. The developing world has to make major change, otherwise this simply couldn't happen in terms of managing to control climate change. So the developing world is hit earliest and hardest, and looking backwards in terms of current concentrations, it's the least responsible for what we find. It's a double inequity. But as my close colleague and former, now deceased Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, used to say, it's not justice to foul the planet because other people have fouled the planet in the past. What we have to do is to find a way to make that change, which is equitable. The not making the change is the most inequitable outcome of all, because it will be the poorer countries that get hit earliest and hardest. So it's not really an equitable response to anything to say, oh, well, this country says we're not going to do this until you do that. That's actually not a good description of equity. It's a route to a deeply inequitable outcome. So we have to find a way. So how do we think about equity? Well, some people have said, well, we all have an equal right to emit as human beings. I've never understood that. I can understand a right to development. I can understand a right to energy. But I don't understand a right to emit. That's a right to severely damage children coming down the track. Is that a right to emit? You have a right to pollute? I don't think so. Now, if we take rights and ethics seriously, and some of us do, and I've got 2 long papers coming out in the Journal of Economics and Philosophy on this year, you've got to take rights seriously and think hard about the ethics. And an equal right to emit is not a serious ethical statement. You can't make a right by simply asserting it. You can't make a right by a right. You can't make a right by asserting it frequently and loudly. That doesn't make it a right. When we talk about rights to development, when we talk about rights to energy, what we're talking about is the equality of people in their ability to participate in human life, in their ability to participate in processes of development. And most of our notions of right come from an idea of equal right of human beings to participate in some notion of society, whether we talk about equality in voting or equality under the law and so on. So I don't go the route that we have an equal right to emit, because I don't see any serious ethical foundation for such a statement. Rights to development, rights to energy within a right to development is a different kind of discussion, which has the same kind of basis as the discussion of other rights. On the other hand, if we ask ourselves about the valuable, the prices on carbon that there should be, and who should get allocations initially as you make those changes, then of course most normal discussions of equity would see actually bigger allocations to those people who are poorer. Normally within a country, if you ask about allocations of welfare, allocations of benefits, most of those discussions point to greater allocations of benefits for people who are poorer. Most people are prepared to go there quite quickly in ethical discussions. So I actually think the equal right to emit is not equitable enough and is deeply flawed in its foundations. But on the other hand, if you go at it in different ways, I think you see that the ethical story that we just started to discuss is even worse, or it points even more strongly, I should say, to stronger allocations to those countries and peoples who are less well off. But not on the basis of the equal right to emit, but on the basis of stories about ethical allocations of valuable assets or valuable resources which might or might not be traded. So I think that the equity side of the story is deeply important, but often very badly discussed. And what we have to do, and it's the language really of India that India introduced into the Cancun negotiations, we have to talk about equitable access to sustainable development. So part of the remit, I think, of the new climate economy, particularly in relation to India and other poorer countries, Ethiopia is one that's very much involved in this, is to think about the meaning of equitable access to sustainable development. It's not equitable access to a train wreck, and that is if we all go on emitting at very high rates and everybody, you know, can just get on with it and that's fine, and because you go to a very bad place. That can't be what we mean. Equal access to sustainable development, not equal access to a downward spiral. But we also have to think about the word equitable and what it means. In this context, I think it means, in very large measure, a story of collaboration and helping each other around technology and around finance in particular. Yeah? What it doesn't mean, I think, is just a very unproductive arm wrestle over space and who gets this and who gets that. That gets you nowhere normally. The story is one of how can we go a different route, a much more attractive route that combines climate responsibility and economic growth and poverty reduction. So that's the equity side. Now let me, I've got 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. So all that is the background, but the basic overarching background that I think we have to bear in mind as we get down, take the jackets off, do the detailed work. The Calderon Commission was set up by a group of us last year, concerned that this story of how you marry climate responsibility and growth wasn't getting a good economics answer, or a good enough economics answer, in a way that would find traction with economic decision makers. Now, as they say, some of my best friends are environment ministers. They're often very nice people, not all of them, but you know, most of them are very nice people. But they don't have political clout. Political clout sits in economics ministries and the Prime Minister's and President's office. That's where it sits. Those are the people that you have to convince. We're talking about getting things done here, not saying nice things. I mean, actually, we should say nice things, but we want to talk about getting them done as well. And you have to get to the economics ministries, the finance ministries, the prime ministers, and the presidents. So we say, well, that's where we start. Now, some of us on the commission, I've worked in a finance ministry and chief economist of the World Bank. We've got Trevor Manuel, one of the longest serving finance ministers in the world. He's the man who held on to the probity of the South African macro economy in what could have been the biggest explosion of public expenditure in the new South Africa. We have Sri Mulyani, who was the finance minister of Indonesia, held her head up in a very difficult and sometimes corrupt situations. We have Jens Stoltenberg, former Prime Minister of Norway, Felipe Calderon, former President of Mexico. So we've got a good group. I won't go through the whole thing, but I want to emphasize that it's about economics ministers, finance ministers, prime ministers, presidents. On the whole, not in office, because it's not so easy for them to speak freely. We've got some of the leading CEOs and chairs of big companies. Those are people who take big economic decisions. And the mayor of Houston and Dan Doctorow, who led Mike Bloomberg's actions in New York City on energy efficiency and emissions and so on. So this is a group of people who either do have or have had very serious economic responsibility. And we have I think what is a very good economic advisory council, including Isha Ahluwalia. So that was the motivation of setting it up in this way. Timing, we've got to report, and since a lot of people working on this in this room, let me say it again, you know it, but I'm going to remind you, this has got to be done, finished, published by the end of August, beginning of September, because it's got to feed into the discussions in New York on 23rd of September. United Nations General Assembly is getting together, and Ban Ki-moon has invited presidents and prime ministers to talk about this with a view to getting us. So what we hope to provide is the next paragraphs and chapters which follow from where the IPCC stopped. They stopped having done a job, but they don't go into the details of how this gets done. They don't go into the details of how you combine economic growth and the specifics of how you combine economic growth with climate responsibility. And they don't, because it wasn't their job, talk about how you convince people with short-run economic horizons that these changes actually are rather a good idea. So that's the task. It's not just they're rather a good idea. If we don't do them, we're in deep trouble. So how do you combine growth and climate responsibility? There is an initial set of stories. I won't go into detail, but it will emerge, and you probably, those of you who are participating, know much about it already. But basically, you want to begin, or most of the story lies in two things. A picture of where you need to go. What kind of economy are we talking about here? What are we talking about, particularly in energy systems, cities, and agriculture? Three very big parts of the story. Different, of course, emphases in different countries, with, of course, agriculture being, forestry being much more important in India and Ethiopia than it would be in the UK. But these are very big parts, and we have to have a picture of where you want to go, because you're trying to persuade people that this is not only feasible, it's also attractive. And you need to convince them of both things. If it were infeasible, but you could imagine it, well, that's not very helpful, even if you imagine something that's attractive. And if it's feasible, but it's, repulsive, you're not going to persuade people to go there. So we have to try to find a picture that is both feasible and attractive. And I think you can. And it has to be a picture of growth in the world economy. It has to be a picture of an energy system that could work, that is not only expanded, because much of the world is going through a period where energy is very important to expand, but also much more productive. That means energy efficiency increases a lot. This is going to be a period of quite extraordinary urbanization. I won't repeat what Rajat just said, but he underlined very clearly just how important it is to establish cities that work and buildings that are efficient and that function in an environmentally friendly way, because cities stay for a long time as they are. An example I often use is that our underground railway in London runs under roads, because it's normally easier, same in Delhi actually, it's normally easier to build them under roads, you cause less disruption. Well, where do your roads come from? Well, somebody took some road choices a while back, like the Romans in London, right? So, I mean, these things have very long echoes in cities, and you're laying out these things now. So they are in China, so they are in India. This next 20 years is not only vitally important from the point of view of this ratchet effect of flows to concentrations that I began with, it's vitally important because you're setting in place the infrastructure which will shape a large part of what happens next. It's not something that we say, well, actually, you know, we've got to fix this bit of the economy now, and we give it 10 years, we'll get going. That's an enormously long time in this process. So it really does matter to get the urban side sorted out. And we're going to hear, and I've had the privilege of hearing some of it already from my old friend Ashok Gulati about what can happen in agriculture. And being a child of Palanpur, I'm fascinated by that part of the story. So that's the kind of picture that we need to build. And some of that detail will come out. But we also have to have policies, not just a picture. You have to start with a picture because that's the story of where you're trying to persuade people to go to. And without that